As I Lay Dying was written in 1928 by William Faulkner. Like most of his other novels, it takes place in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County in Mississippi. He wrote it exclusively between midnight and 4 a.m. over the course of 6 weeks and did not change a word of it, which makes sense if you read it. The book follows a family living on a farm with two parents, Addie and Anse Bundren, and their 5 children, from oldest to youngest, Cash, Darl, Jewel, who's illegitimate, Dewey Dell, and Vardaman. At the start of the book, Addie Bundren is, as the title suggests, laying dying. And on page 48 of 261, Addie Bundren dies. For the rest of the book, it follows the perspectives of the family members and some other people as her body is transported 40 miles to the city of Jefferson, where she requested she be buried. So the story follows how her husband and each of her children grieve her death and grapple with the consequences. So what was Addie Bundren like? I don't know. Considering the title of the book is clearly written from her perspective, she doesn't have a whole lot to say. Before she dies, she's a living corpse, and after, she's a corpse, and it's not until almost 2/3 of the way through the book that she narrates her one and only section, which is only 5 pages long. For a book completely about Addie Bundren, we really don't know what's going on with Addie Bundren. Before her speaking part, we can only very vaguely piece together what she was like from the way that her children grieve her. 2 of her kids, Darl and Vardaman, grieve by examining death in general, examining the philosophy of life and death, but not really reflecting on who their mother was as a person. Dewey Dell has her own things to worry about, and Cash spends the entire book either building a coffin or talking about how to build a coffin. The final child, Jewel, who would give the most insight into who she was, has a single 1-page section at the beginning where he's seething at his siblings, so that doesn't give us much. But Addie's section changes everything. Addie's short appearance as a narrator late into the book, despite the entire book revolving around the idea of her, serves to humanize the other characters and the way that they grieve. So before Addie's section, the motivations of the characters are pretty unknown, and even though we see the world from their perspective, which includes like hearing their every thought, it felt like words on a page for a while. But like any good flashback, Addie's chapter turns the characters from actors in a play to real humans capable of the full range of emotions. Up to that point, they are naturally a sum of their actions. They kind of just do what Faulkner tells them to do. And a lot of the familial dynamics are pretty unexplained up to that point. Like, everyone hates ants. Jewel doesn't talk. And the neighbors, the Toll family, have a never-ending stream of annoying opinions. But in her section, we find out that people hate Ants because he's ignorant and incapable of empathy. Jewel seems like a loner because he was raised to be a loner by Addie. And the Toll family is just the Toll family. They've been like that. Addie's section lets you know that they've been giving unsolicited opinions for years. And Addie's relationship with each of her family members might not be known to them, but it's absolutely known to her. And for this reason, the characters are so frustratingly, excruciatingly human. In her section, Addie even mentions the fact that Ance's ignorance and willingness to prop up this system that oppresses her is like so far beyond his intelligence level that he couldn't possibly be doing it intentionally. All of her children are, like, at the end of the day, a bunch of people living in Mississippi in 1928 who just lost their mother. These aren't characters where the writer has an arc in mind or they have character flaws they have to overcome. They're just people going through a bad time in their life. And because of that, like, reading this book makes you feel like a god in the most mediocre way possible. Like, you can sympathize with essentially every character in the book if you try hard enough and look down on them as much as you want, but at the end of the day, they're just people doing what they think is right, and who's to say you would even change it if you could? And that's kind of the reason this book just, like, tears you to shreds, is that they're just a bunch of people. So, yeah. Addie's short narrative section serves to show why the characters, especially her 5 children, grieve the way that they do, but more specifically how Addie grieves her own death, which she believes to be her being consigned to motherhood before she dies. So one of the most interesting parts of this section is how Addie grieves her own death before she dies. So, like, in a breakup, generally, the person who does the breaking up could feasibly feel the same amount of grief as the person being broken up with. But the person who does the breaking up has their grief before the breakup, and the person broken up with has their grief after. And so in this case, the breakup is death, and Addie gets her grieving done while she can, which is when she's alive. She even says at one point that living is just preparing to be dead for a while, which lines up pretty well with this interpretation. So let me just explain a little bit. So Addie grieves her own death in life in the same way that all of her children individually grieve her death. Just like Darlin Vardaman, she examines semiotics, and in her stream of consciousness thinks about words until they lose meaning. Darlin Vardaman grapple with their mother's death by examining death itself, looking at semiotics, and thinking about what it means to be alive or dead. They try to understand what gives those words meaning, which Addie also does. She talks about how words dissolve into nothing. In addition to that, Addie laments the fact that she's not seen as a person, but as a mother, which is something that Dewey Dell struggles with the entire book. She has Jewel as an act of independence, and so Jewel's very existence is a rebellion against society, which is reflected in Jewel's independent, rebellious personality. And for both Jewel and Addie, we hardly get their perspective, both of them only having a single narrative section. In Jewel's section, he seems to keep his distance, perhaps unable to confront his grief. And like mentioned before, Jewel has a single one-page section, but we know through Addie's section that he represents her independence from rebellion, which speaks volumes about him as a character. One of the other things that Addie grieves while she's alive is believing that the experience of motherhood is indescribable. She laments the fact that her complexity as a person is completely overshadowed by her ability to have and raise children when determining her societal worth. At the same time, she uses motherhood as a way to rebel with Jewel. And before her section of the book, like mentioned before, we barely know anything about Addie. None of the other characters that Addie resented know that Addie resented her family and that the life she lived, because it's just not what the other characters were thinking about. The other characters were thinking about themselves and only thinking about Addie in relation to themselves and how her death affected them. And it sounds kind of selfish, but the idea is basically the foundation for solipsism, which is essentially saying that the only thing you know to be real is your own mind, and things only matter in relation to you, which kind of makes sense. Like, everything you've ever known has gone through the filter of your brain, so everything that's ever existed is to you what you think about everything that's ever existed, and the things that happen around you are tainted by your own opinions and your own experiences, and the only way to make sense of anything is to think about how it relates to you. And the way that now you can think about her children as how they relate to her. Like, she is a sum of the 5 people she created. She grieves in all the same ways. So her section just gives a lot of perspective on like why the characters are the way that they are. It's because they are all her. They came from her. Which sounds like super obvious, but it's like when you read it, it's like mind-blowing. Multiple narrators allows Faulkner to show the streams of consciousness of each character, which serves to give all the many characters incredible depth and humanize them despite the relatively short length of the book. So for context, stream of consciousness is a narrative technique where the thoughts of the characters aren't incredibly well formed, but rather the actual words that the characters would think at the time, malformed as the grammar may be. So the streams of consciousness of each character lets the audience see how the characters are feeling rather than just reading how they're feeling. Rarely, if ever, do the characters declare an emotion that they're feeling, but rather every thought that passes through your mind lets the reader piece together how they're feeling in a much more natural way, which I really like. And this is part of the reason why this book caused us a little bit of confusion. At the beginning, it's easy to not like the characters because you don't understand what they do. They're not narrating to us the same way your internal monologue isn't like narrating the things around you, so it's sometimes hard to tell what's happening. And they're not like justifying their own actions or opinions. That's just like who they are. Like, you don't have to justify yourself to yourself. And this is especially true for Addie, where you feel like, in the sense that you really can understand her perspective. If you were her, you would do nothing different. Like, the best tragedies are written when the characters do everything right, but still lose. And Addie does everything right, but still loses. And she actually does give justification for her actions, and throughout her whole backstory when she's telling it to you, like, she doesn't make any major missteps. She's just, like, doing all the right things, but got a terrible hand dealt to her. And all they said, sometimes the stream of consciousness is kind of gibberishy, and it seems like Faulkner has, like, a vendetta against commas or something. The youngest child, Vardaman, who also has stream of consciousness, gives his insane opinions constantly, and he's like 5. Like, I don't know what I was thinking about when I was 5. Probably nothing that productive. But yeah, sometimes the Vardaman sections go on a little bit too long, and they're interesting, but again, not that many commas, kind of a lot of words in a row. So, you know, pros and cons. But mostly the stream of consciousness is really great, and it lets you get inside the characters' heads. Okay, so we're going to take a really quick pivot and talk about another extremely important theme in the book, which is religion. So for most of this video, we've been talking about death and grief because that's a lot of what Addie talks about in her section. But her section and the section before also provide an interesting take on religion. So I briefly mentioned the Tull family, their neighbors, so I'm going to be talking about the wife, Cora Tull. So they're neighbors of the Bundrens, and they have so much to say about them and to them. Primarily, though, whatever they have to say, they use religion to back that up. Cora has a section immediately before Addie's, and the two sections sort of speak to each other, even though it's not like actual dialogue. Well, there is a little bit, but most of it's not dialogue. So the subclaim, the disparity in the use of religion between Addie and Cora serves to point out the inanity of sin and salvation and how people use these words to justify living whatever life they want. So Cora essentially spends her entire section criticizing how Addie won't open up her heart to the Lord or renounce her sin. Addie has a super quick retort to this, claiming that people to whom sin is just a matter of words, to them salvation is just words too. Addie implies that Cora's religious beliefs are preachy and somewhat performative, and that Addie doesn't need to justify her actions to anyone but herself. So Cora also claims that a woman's life is right in the sight of man, while Addie, as mentioned previously, obviously resents the society that paints her as an object or a vessel to have children. Another example, Cora's super preachy about the suffering that Addie goes through, saying that God gave her children to comfort your hard human lot for a token of his own suffering and love. Addie obviously believes that her own suffering is gratuitous and doesn't see it as a purpose like Cora does. And Addie doesn't choose to renounce her sin, but deals with the unfree world the only way she knows how, becoming so absolutely free that her very existence is an act of rebellion. To complement all of this, Preacher Whitfield, which is the illegitimate father of Jewel, narrates after Addie, which serves to emphasize the hypocrisy of what Cora is saying, since Cora explicitly states that Whitfield is a, quote, godly man if one ever breathed God's breath. And this is obviously ironic, since Whitfield is Jewel's real father and cheated with Addie knowing that she was married to Ants. So Cora and Whitfield both use religion in a hypocritical way, Cora using it to tear down others, and Whitfield using it to justify his own actions. And in these two sections, Addie is probably like the most down-to-earth character in any book we've read. She doesn't feel a need to justify her own actions with anything external or existential. She just does what she thinks is right for her and wants to do, which is super real. In describing this book, I think I agree with Addie Bundren when she says that motherhood was invented by someone who had to have a word for it, because the ones that had the children didn't care whether there was a word for it or not. There are no words to capture this book, barring the 4 pages of words that you just heard. This book is but most of all, I came away from it knowing one thing. My mother is a fish. Thank you for listening.